In this ageless valley, a new breed of warrior has been born. Born to rage against the silence of these ancient rocks. Born to tear apart the very fabric of the desert. Born to win at any cost. The stage is set. A storm is coming. The land braces itself. Welcome to MotorStorm.
Founded in 1999 in Cheshire, England, Evolution Studios went on to have a moderate success with their off-road racing sim series based on the WRC for the PlayStation 2. But as the 7th generation loomed, Sony wanted something different. The PlayStation 3 was on the horizon, and they wanted something to show off its capability. The World Rally Championship games had been solid, but Evolution wanted to do something else. They didn't necessarily want to flip the script, but they wanted to create something different to what they had done before. Sony wanted two things: a game that could show off the hardware, and a launch title. They ended up with one simple statement: brutal off-road racing. The 6th generation had been very fruitful for many genres and subgenres therein. From electronic arts to Rockstar, to Sony's own Psygnosis and the almighty Criterion, there have been plenty of excellent action racing games made on the 6th generation. Being one of the first games on a brand new console had its own particular stresses, but more than anything, it was the expectation set by some of the best action racing games ever made, and some of the best action games just in general. Early build footage clearly demonstrates that these vehicles were always meant to handle like plastic toy cars and bounce around rather aimlessly instead of traditional vehicles weighted to the ground. MotorStorm was never intended to be a car combat game similar to Twisted Metal or Flat Out, instead going for something a little bit more freeform. The way the cars bounce off of each other and generally have this rough and tumble nature is very fun to watch. The driving model they were aiming for was certainly arcadey, but they needed an environment to suit it. The handling might be completely different to what they had done before, but the environment would still be heavily off-roading there, with a level of exaggeration as this was now an action racing game. Set on the border between Utah and Arizona, Monument Valley is as dangerous as it is beautiful. From the sun-kissed deserts to the clear blue skies, towering mesas and thick, viscous mud, this is a place designed to be easy on the eye, but never on the vehicles thundering through it. But the festival isn't just cars, it's heavily based upon music as well. The natural beauty of this western frontier being destroyed by tuned-up monstrosities and drunk hotheads seems like, well, it actually seems like my kind of place, really. But these environments wouldn't be static. Track deformation was an absolute considered feature, with repeated laps making certain aspects of the map completely unusable as mud becomes too thick to pass through for most common vehicles. As a result, the environment has its own considerations, from the aforementioned mud to smoother surfaces like rocks. Certain vehicles just won't do well on these particular surfaces, and that's part of the fun of learning the game. A vast array of vehicles, a collection of considered maps, and the best part of all, no story. The baseline was strong, but they needed something else. Another mechanic, something to set it truly apart from the competition. And that's where the boost came in. In most games, the boost meter is merely used as a modifier. The tank is full, the tank is used, and the tank is empty until it's refilled. But MotorStorm does things a little bit differently. The vehicle lineup in MotorStorm is an interestingly mixed bag. There are 7 types of vehicles: bikes, ATVs, buggies, rally cars, racing trucks, mud pluggers, and big rigs. A varied roster to be sure, as Evolution ended up winning a world record for the most amount of vehicle types in one game. but it's not all titties and birthday cake, as some of these classes definitely drew the short straw. Bikes are shit. They seem to spin out at the first sign of trouble, and they basically get trounced by every other vehicle type. This game has surfaces in mind for all of the vehicles like I mentioned, but bikes don't seem to have any kind of surface, and they go for mud, and it is just a fucking mess. Oh, they're fast. They're really fucking fast. But it don't mean shit when I'm spun out for the 7th time in the first round. It's neat to be able to flip off the other races, but I'm never alive that long to be able to see it play out anyway. When the game has bike-only races, they're not too bad. They function relatively well, even if the handling is still very difficult to get a hold of. The way the bikes just get so effortlessly pushed around by the other classes, I can't give these class anything other than an honorary manlet status. Still, that might be one reason to like the bikes. Yeah. ATVs are pretty good. They're a lot better than bikes. I mean, for one, the grip is actually pretty good, and the turning circle isn't so bad that you can't play the game. So, already a marked improvement. They're not as fast as the bikes, but they can weave decently well through the other vehicles, and as a result, the handling is much better to deal with. However, due to the admittedly lacking stature, they do tend to get picked on by the other classes. But they can pick on the bikes, so who really gives a shit? And, well, the game told me to pick on the bikes, so that's what I did. ATVs? Not that bad. It's been a while, I seem to have forgotten the controls. Holy Toledo. Buggies are a bit disappointing. They're kind of lame. Not really due to how they actually work in the game, as they're a serviceable class, but rather the emphasis that's placed on them by the game. I mean, the yellow wombat tycoon is positively iconic to the game's aesthetic, but despite that, not that great. They're bouncy to a degree where they tend to lose speed. And to be perfectly honest, they feel like they're made of paper mache. But the speed is good and they look pretty cool. Plus, because of the really nice turning circle, it's always fun to smack people. Especially the bikes. Pretty enjoyable overall, but not my favorite. My favorite would be the rally cars. Rally cars are the true all-rounders of MotorStorm. They're much better than most of the classes. They're the fastest cars on the track, and they're very fun to steer. They're not indestructible, but they can throw their way around decently enough. The other thing is, they're cool as fuck. The game says that these cars don't tend to do well outside of straightaways, but to be perfectly honest, I found they did decently well on pretty much any surface, though smoother surfaces did tend to work a little bit better. Funnily enough, the game's most enjoyable vehicle class is the most similar to their previous games. Plus, I can look like the last V8 Interceptor. Mwah. Racing trucks are, dare I say, the most realistic class in the game. They're a bit too slow and they're quite heavy, but they're fun to control and they do bounce around enough to be enjoyable. Plus, it's always fun to completely batter the bikes, remind them who they are. But all in all, this is a fairly average class. Not too bad though. Decent. They look nice. My second favorite class probably ended up being the Mud Pluggers. They're bouncy like buggies, but don't tend to slow down as much after jumps. This particular class highlights the rough and tumble driving model that was first envisioned in the concept build. It's a fun class. The way they power slide around corners is pretty satisfying, and despite the naming, these are easily the best all-terrain vehicles in the game. The traction is excellent, but I wouldn't exactly call it a smooth ride. But then there's the big rigs. Heavy, slow, uneasy to control, but barrels for absolutely everything. These vehicles are a bit of a joke in harder races, but they were intended for fun. With the handling being half brick shithouse and half overpowered Tonka truck, there is no chance for our vehicles to survive against this one. It might be difficult to win in a race, but but a battle is a whole different story. For that reason alone, I have to say that the big rigs are the undisputed, absolute fuck-off class of MotorStorm. MotorStorm might not have an equal footing with its vehicles, but the sheer level of variety is definitely appreciated. Having up to 16 races with 7 different types of vehicles, it's always a blast, and visually it's jaw-dropping most of the time. It's also interesting to see how boost affects particular vehicle classes. Some might be saved from certain death by boosting out of a corner, and some it might merely be a modifier. Knowing what surfaces are intended for certain vehicles is interesting and also very fun to learn. Despite my incessant shitting on a particular vehicle, I gotta say that the game does a good job of making it feel like each one has their place. When a race has one vehicle type making up the entirety of the roster, it highlights the differences between the vehicles, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. To top that all off, there are sub-choices about which particular vehicle to use in each class. It might not be a completely balanced experience, it's not even particularly well balanced at all, but it's certainly unique. The tracks of MotorStorm are all set within the arid, sunburnt desert of Monument Valley. As expected, setting a game in a desert can bring a few problems in terms of variety, and whilst I do think the team has done an admirable job of showing different locales and gameplay styles, it certainly is a bit of an issue. There's no beating around this bush, or in this case, a tumbleweed. The game has some variety problems, to be sure. Of the 8 tracks, Rain God Mesa, The Grizzly, Mudpool, Tenderizer, Rockhopper, Sidewinder Gulch, Coyote Rage, and Dust Devil, I could only remember 2 of these maps, and the rest I couldn't remember the names, or even which ones were which. Whilst I do find it hard to tell them apart, I can say on the purely gameplay front, they're quite good. Tracks tend to be quite open, and usually follow some sort of free lane structure. What really impressed me the most about all of these, though, was the level of verticality. Certain parts of the map could be 100 feet higher than the rest. It does make the maps feel distinct in terms of gameplay, if not visual. It's clear that the first consideration of each map was not how it would play necessarily, but how the vehicles would respond to it. From the multiple surfaces to the mud physics, and subsequently the general sort of track deformation, it's interesting to consider the maps play more like an obstacle course than a traditional racing game. The multiple surfaces might have their own intended vehicles, but the mud itself is its own problem. Due to the track deformation, on a first lap of a race, getting through mud with a vehicle that isn't meant for it might be difficult, but on the second or third lap of a race, the mud is so churned up that it's actually fucking useless. As this system makes parts of the map completely unusable by the third lap, it means that routes effectively change on the fly. It's incredibly dynamic and very fun to play, and it means learning the map each time. There are small sort of hidden shortcuts and pathways that can only be accessed by the smaller vehicles, and the bigger ones will struggle. But, alternatively, there are light destruction elements to the game, and so, bigger vehicles will be able to get through these elements, while smaller vehicles will just crash. The tracks might suffer from a visual variety, but the gameplay certainly doesn't. They made a choice between one or the other, and they went with the right option. A track's layout being defined by previous laps is a level of gameplay choice that hasn't been seen very often before in other racing games. But the tracks aren't entirely natural either. There are big half pipes to ride and massive ramps to jump. The tracks are pure gameplay, which is absolutely the best choice for a racing game like this. The gameplay might be excellent, but my biggest issue with the tracks is the number. 8's a good number in any other game, but in this case, it's just not good enough for how undistinct each map is from each other. As far as a favorite, after my last statements, I don't think it would make much sense to pick one. But I will say that the Rockhopper highlights many of the terrain differences, whilst also showing the free lane structure in an interesting way. It may also be the most visually distinct map of the bunch, so I guess it gets credit for that too. Overall though, despite the pretty obvious issues, I think the tracks are actually a success. They're fun to play, and rewarding to learn. The way the tracks work in tandem with the particular vehicles themselves is very satisfying to see, and doesn't come around too often. The maps have a mechanical focus more than anything else. I just wish visually they had the same variety as the vehicles. At the risk of repeating myself, I'll say that the environmental differences in how the vehicles have their place within the sandbox and how they're affected by those environmental differences is an incredibly cool change to the racing game formula. But MotorStorm's biggest problem is easily its lack of variety and overall content. The gameplay loop is solid enough, but it needs more to fall onto. The lack of any serious other modes than just races does hurt this game in considerable margin. There's no free play either. It's all connected to the ticket system, which is fine enough, but it really just highlights how many of these tickets there are and how repetitive this game can truly get. More than 3 laps for a start, that would be kind of nice. It's clear this game was marketed towards the multiplayer crowd, as Sony wanted to really show PSM's appeal. But it just means that half the fucking game isn't playable now, and there's no split screen either. I mean, shit, I know that living in the void I don't have enough friends to play with anyway, but damn, this is 2007. Split screen's been around for years. With only 2 modes, Festival and Multiplayer, one of which I can't even fucking play anymore, it really does highlight that this game struggles with a lack of any kind of longevity. Doing the same races, seemingly the same races anyway, over and over again might be fun for a little while, but damn does it get fucking boring. It's a shame too, because the overall gameplay is pretty excellent. I mean, it's not particularly well balanced, and as I mentioned before, the lighter vehicles definitely do struggle, but the overall experience is fun and it's enjoyable, and again, split screen probably would have helped this game quite a bit. It's the perfect game for split screen considering how bouncy the physics are and how it's encouraged to sort of ram into people. I can't have any overarching choice in what I'm actually playing, but at least I've got my 6-axis motion controls. What interests me is that this game isn't necessarily bad by its own virtues or even its own design, but rather what stands out to me and what defines the experience is sadly what it's lacking as opposed to anything else. Oh yeah, they left out the custom soundtrack feature too, which was planned, so now I'm stuck with mid-2000s butt rock and drum and bass. I might as well talk about the music now. As the cutscene at the start of the game shows, MotorStorm Festival is not just a racing festival, but also a music festival. So, as expected, there is a large amount of music that is present throughout the game. Problem is, it's not my thing at all. In complete fairness to the game, this isn't my usual type of music anyway. I don't like bum rock very much at all, and drum and bass, well, I don't think drum and bass has ever been cool. Some of the electronic tracks in this game are pretty decent though, and they probably ended up being my favorites from the track selection. They really hyped up the custom soundtrack feature as well, which makes it even more disappointing, but to me it's just a real crying shame. I want my own choices. I want to hear Desert Plains by Judas Priest or Hello America by Def Leppard. Plus, this is Arizona, Utah. It's basically the Old West, the frontier. Give me some outlaw country. I want to hear Don't You Think This Outlaw bit's done gone out of hand. But no, can't do it. Though, in fairness, every time I hear that Pendulum song, it does make me want to swat a few bikes. But fuck me, did I ever get tired of I wanna take you on a roller coaster. I will say though, despite it not really being my thing, it fits the game reasonably well. It's a lacking music list for a frankly lacking game. The audio in MotorStorm is also a considerably basic effort. It's not bad, it definitely gets the job done. The vehicle sounds suitably beefy enough, but although there's a lot of terrain differences in the game itself, the audio doesn't really account for this. For a game called MotorStorm, I expected a bit more of a sort of angry sounding crowd of vehicles. violent churning metal angrily bashing against each other, but instead it's just a little bit more simple than that. Still, there are some nice touches. The way a car's engine cycles down after disengaging abuse is always a very satisfying sound. And there is also something quite humorous about hearing all the different vehicles engaging with boost at the same time and hearing that particular audio gets the job done. There just isn't much to talk about, and the ambient effects are lacking in almost every regard. The audio works best when it's informing the player of particular changes within the gameplay loop. Hearing other people boost is a useful tool and an enjoyable one. I just expected more of a
Violent cacophony.
This is absolutely where the game shines. Every surface, every vehicle, even the skybox is met with an exquisite level of detail that just hasn't been seen up until this point. Being that this is a dry landscape, the color palette is admittedly pretty limited, but as a result the team spent a lot of time and clearly a lot of effort into making sure every effect looks convincing and beautiful. From the thick plumes of dust to the deep tire tracks left behind the cars, it's all rendered in just a beautiful amount of detail. For as much as I criticize the samey looking tracks, I will admit that it gives the overarching environment more personality, as there is a continuity between them. The mud being one of the main mechanics means that it ultimately also looks very good. These very deep lines left in there, it's quite obvious that the cars have already been through it. If they haven't, it shines quite brightly in the sun. The world is positively realistic and it really pops on the screen. It's an absolutely gorgeous looking world. But a racing game is nothing without the vehicles perusing through it. The amount of work and attention to detail that went into each and every vehicle type, at least visually, is absolutely staggering. The loading screens between matches take a little while. I don't mind too much because the menu tips are just hilarious. But choosing the vehicles and the subcategories between them does seem to take a little while. I think that's also due to the amount of detail put into these vehicles. There's a wide selection of vehicles, each with their own unique look, and on top of that, there's a decent choice of liveries too. Each one of these cars really pops on the screen. They're very visually bright. As a result, they end up being the most colourful thing in the environment, which really sets them apart. But by the end of the races though, wow, these things are absolutely caked in dirt. They look like little bricks of shit rolling across the map. It's both disgusting and incredible. The damage model is also pretty strong. Pieces of car fall off in all different places, and loose hoods and doors seem to rattle and shake around. Funny enough, if pieces do fall off, they just stay in the track. If there's one thing I perhaps don't like about the visuals, it's the overly aggressive motion blur. I don't usually get motion sick in games, and I wasn't even particularly motion sick with this one, but it does do its job of conveying a certain level of speed, and whenever the boost kicks in this game, it's a fucking joyride. Easily my favorite effect in the whole game is seeing flames violently shoot out from underneath the cars when it gets to the top of an overboost. The boost is visually very exciting, but it never veers into the territory of being distracting. Sony wanted a game to show off the visual hardware of the PS3, and boy did they ever fucking get it. This is the best looking launch title the PS3 has. Ironically enough, Evolution Studios ended up tearing down a lot of the ideas established in previous off-road racing games. A lot of those same off-road racing games and ideas they had established themselves. But they wanted something different from MotorStorm, and Sony were happy to let them do it as long as it worked in their favor. For all its shortcomings, it's clear that there was a palpable excitement from the people who made this. From these old interviews, there's a passion for what they've created, and they have a genuine interest in what they do. I am not an expert, quite clearly, and I don't know how long this game was in development for. but judging from the look of it all, I would say that this was a bit of a scramble to get in time for the PS3 release. And that's not a bad thing. This is one of the better launch titles, and it's certainly one of the better looking ones, because usually launch titles end up looking like, well, shit. This is good. It's a real good start, but it's definitely a launch title. It's an absolutely commendable effort, and for the short time that should be spent with it, it's a fun time. By the end of 2007, MotorStorm had sold 1 million copies in the US alone, making it the highest selling PlayStation 3 launch title of the original lineup. Evolution Studios may have crafted the template, but they still had yet to set the tone.
The screeching howl of rubber, the thunderous applause of metal. The air turns cold. The storm will return.